for that introduction. It's kind of funny being now standing at the lectern on the podium when I once was, like you, panicky trying to finish papers at the last minute. Lovely student came out and said, I've got a paper due Friday, what are you going to talk about? And I said, well, blood diamonds. That's what the topic of this lecture is, but I do understand. And hopefully I can give you some useful information. Again, thank you, Cynthia, for the invitation. Thank you to Organization for International Development here at the Elliott School. Again, it's wonderful to be back here. My alma mater, wonderful experiences here at the Elliott School, and I really am grateful for the good education that I received. And also especially thanks to you all for coming out this afternoon to hear me speak and to just share about, learn about information on conflict diamonds. Briefly, just let me tell you what I do. I work at WorldVision. WorldVision is an international Christian relief and development agency that has been working for the past 57 years to build a better world for children. WorldVision serves all people, regardless of religion, race, ethnicity, or gender. We're operational in over 95 countries, and in sub-Saharan Africa in particular, WorldVision has operations in 24 countries, giving both on-the-ground emergency assistance as well as working with communities to achieve long-term economic development. And again, my name is Rory Anderson, and I'm Senior Policy Advisor for Africa at WorldVision. And I guess technically, what is a Senior Policy Advisor? Basically, technically, I'm a lobbyist, but I don't really like to say I'm a lobbyist because I carry a lot of baggage in this town. But in reality, my role within WorldVision, which is again a non-governmental organization or NGO, my role is to really try to influence U.S. policy to help better shape U.S.-Africa foreign policy, so that U.S. policies actually do a better job of serving the poor, whom I'm assuming as you, as students interested in international development, are also seeking to serve as well. So along with the free lunch, and I guess people have papers due, I think I'm supposed to talk about what the real story on blood diamonds. I understand the best things in life are free, right? So free lunch here, but I think the hook was to talk about natural resources and conflict. I will focus my remarks mostly on conflict diamonds because that's what I'm most familiar with and most knowledgeable about. I would probably title my talk Conflict Diamonds and how they're funding conflict and fueling change. But again, we can talk about natural resources as well, other natural resources in our question and answer session as well. I want to try and keep my remarks as brief as possible. I will start out with a 10-minute video. Actually, I pulled this from our campaign archives. It was done in May of 2000, but it does give a good overview of the issue. And then I'll talk for about 30 minutes, and then hopefully we'll have about 20 to 30 minutes for questions and answers. I think we'll aim to be ending about 1:30. So again, thank you, and with that, oh, boy, okay, the flat screen has gone blank. Help. Technical assistance, 1 moment. Okay, here we go. Okay. One second, we're having technical difficulties, obviously, so. Well, at least the video's working. Okay, can we try the sound here? Sound this thing on.
Is that it's like recorded?
Let's just rewind this, see if we can always get some of the initial. Sorry about that. To get the full effect of the video, it helps to have the sound. So, all right, so
thanks to WorldVision and Amnesty International and Physicians for Human Rights, our friends from Sierra Leone, 73 very important fighters of human rights around the world. We're so glad to have you with us. My friend and colleague, Congressman Frank Werfen, and I know Congresswoman Cynthia McKinney will be here. Our goal today is to protest blood diamonds and to give information to Americans so that they can make up their mind to do something about the stopping of buying blood diamonds. I've been talking to individuals and to reporters and to groups large and small about blood diamonds for about a year and a half. And I have not met a person who isn't horrified by the reality of these diamonds and what they mean. People who see diamonds as tokens of love and commitment and glamour are amazed to learn that many are really symbols of butchery, of amputations, of sexual slavery, of rapes of children that are forced into these gangs that are fighting with rebels. And this isn't something that happened long ago. It's happening now, and it's been happening for at least 20 years. Today's soldiers and rebels will earn approximately $37 million trading blood diamonds. And tomorrow they'll earn $37 million, and so on until they pocket about $2 billion a year. And this kind of money goes a long way in places where an AK-47 costs $6. Now, the legitimate diamond industry says it's horrified by this trade. I think they're terrified, to be more accurate, because they're terrified its product's image will be destroyed forever. 7 months ago, the diamond industry announced it would cooperate with African leaders working to end the trade in conflict diamonds. It made a solemn vow to act immediately, and it promised the human rights community and others it would deliver a watertight system no later than Christmas of 2000. It hasn't happened. We're not even past the talk phase, and at a time when tens of thousands of more refugees are facing misery and death as these wars widen. Today, in the spirit of Valentine's Day, I want to call again on the diamond industry to honor its solid commitment and stop participating in this blood trade. Rebels could not have turned their contraband diamonds into ready cash without this industry's complicity. Yet they did and still are using legitimate dealers to launder their bloody loot. Today, tens of millions of Americans will stop talking about romance and they'll start acting on it. Little kids will deliver their construction paper valentines to classmates, and adults will deliver the gifts and affections that express their feelings, and many young people will deliver the diamonds that to them symbolize love, but too often deliver profits into rebels' coffers. For each lucky American who gets a diamond, and certainly if it's a blood diamond, there will be dozens of Africans who pay for it in blood. Today, if the diamond industry fears at all for those who are suffering the collateral damage of their trade, it needs to deliver. To those diamond barons meeting in Namibia, to those counting their profits in the United States and London and Johannesburg, we would say, honor your commitment. Do more than talk. Take action to stop this blood trade.
That was a former Congressman Tony Hall. Again, that was actually at our kickoff events, the Valentine's Day press conference actually in 2001. Excuse me, I misspoke. I said 2000. It's actually, that was during a press conference at the National Press Club in 2001. Tony Hall was speaking. He was our former, he was a member of Congress for 24 years, and he was recently our UN ambassador, U.S. ambassador to the United Nations agencies in Rome, particularly the Food and Agriculture Organization. Ambassador Hall really did a significant job in putting the issue of conflict diamonds on the political map here in the U.S. in the late 1990s and early 2000s, up until he retired from Congress in 2002. Now, I have been involved in advocacy on conflict diamonds since the year 2000. I worked with colleagues from Amnesty International, Physicians for Human Rights, to really establish the U.S. campaign to eliminate conflict diamonds. I also worked on the international level with key non-governmental organizations, in particular Global Witness and Partnership Africa Canada, and there were other organizations, but those are the primary two. At the international level, we worked together. I represented the U.S. campaign to eliminate conflict diamonds, and at the international level, we helped to establish a trade regime, as Cynthia mentioned, known as the Kimberley Process certification system. Just to go back to Congressman Hall's presentation and hone in on some of the key points. First, what are conflict diamonds? Just redefining them again. Simply, they are diamonds which are used to purchase weapons, which are then used to fuel human rights abuses and wars. Conflict diamonds has really been an issue before policymakers for almost 10 years. But in December 2006, the movie Blood Diamonds, starring Leonardo DiCaprio, actually helped to bring the issue to the broader public conscience. Now, in my opinion, I think the movie did an excellent job. It's a very good movie, and it did a very good job of depicting the direct link that the diamonds that were mined in Sierra Leone, which is in West Africa, and showing that direct link between how Sierra Leonean rebels mined diamonds, and then they used these diamonds to purchase weapons, which fueled a very grisly war against civilians in the late 1990s. If you've not seen the movie, I highly recommend that you rent it. Leo has done a great job. He's come a long way from the Titanic, and he actually does a pretty good job with the Zimbabwean smuggler accent. I do recommend the movie, but it's a very good and a very good portrayal and very accurate portrayal of a very sad reality. So second, where do conflict diamonds primarily occur? Now, as described in the video, you saw some of the scenes of children who were amputees, as well as the references by Mr. Hall. What I just described, and what a lot of the focus of our campaigning in the early 2000s really focused around Sierra Leone, which is in West Africa, and also in Angola, which is in Southern Africa. And these were the two countries which received a lot of policy focus as well as campaign focus in 2000. Just to go back a little bit about the history of conflict diamonds and the history of the issues, in the late 1990s in Sierra Leone, there were really two inseparable factors which sustained a brutal civil war in Sierra Leone, and that ultimately inflicted the kind of horrors that you saw in these videos of these children being amputated. First, really, the first factor that helped enable the brutal civil war in Sierra Leone was really decades of official legitimized corruption within the state of Sierra Leone. And a lot of that corruption was actually rooted in the diamond trade. This corruption basically left remnants of a failed state, and this failed state within Sierra Leone was unable to defend its own territories from both internal and external threats. This then resulted in the breakdown of law and order. And so this absence of national security within Sierra Leone really provided an economic opportunity for conflict diamonds to flourish. But because of international pressure over conflict diamonds, combined with a small contingent of British troops backing up what was then called UNAMSL, which was a fledgling UN mission that was seeking to implement the peacekeeping deal that was signed between the government and the rebels, British troops came in to help support that UN mission, and the 11-year conflict in Sierra Leone ended with elections in 2002. In Angola, which is located in southern Africa, elections actually took place in 1992 between the government of Angola and the rebel group known as UNITA, which stands for the Portuguese acronym, which stands for Union for the Total Independence of Angola. These elections were considered free and fair by the international community, but UNITA rebel leader, Jonas Savimbi, who was standing for president, basically refused to accept the election results. And because he lost the election, he just simply went back to war by seizing the Coango River Valley, which is Angola's richest diamond mining territory. UNITA began a major mining operation that basically made them the richest rebels in Africa. Diamond money paid for UNITA offenses that in the 1990s basically elevated Angola's civil war to a higher level of savagery, killing more than 500,000 people, displacing 4 million people, and maiming 90,000 civilians as a result of landmines. The assassination of Jonas Savimbi in February 2002 actually quickly brought the 27-year-old Angolan civil war actually to an end. So during both of these conflicts in Sierra Leone and Angola, guaranteed access to the diamond mines eventually became a dominant incentive for war. And ironically, the chaos of war actually enabled the diamond industry to prosper. Usually people think that during the height of war, business doesn't flourish. But actually in this instance, the diamond industry actually prospered and flourished. Because conflict diamonds can be hidden and smuggled so easily, a dealer can buy low, sell high, and reap windfall profits, particularly during the height of war. As the wars in Angola and Sierra Leone continue to drag on with really no popular support, no ideological support to underpin their reasons for conflict, eventually the point of these wars, both in Sierra Leone and Angola, was actually not to win them. The point was not to win them, but actually to engage in profitable crime under the cover of warfare. The informal diamond mining sector has long been dominated by what one could say called disorganized crime. But during the height of war, this sector was actually influenced by organized crime. And so there's a whole network of transcontinental smuggling of diamonds, guns, and drugs, and vast sums of money really in search of a laundry. Each of these smuggled items were actually central, critical components to warfare, and thus violence really became central to the advancement of those with vested interests. So in Sierra Leone and Angola, conflict diamonds are eventually, thankfully, becoming more or less a thing of the past. But as both countries are continuing to transition from war, as I mentioned, Sierra Leone had elections in 2002, and with Savimbi's assassination, the country was quickly able to resume elections, and now they're going through their own transition. So conflict diamonds is less of a focus policy issue for those two countries, but conflict diamonds are still in existence, and so that's why I show this video, because it is still an issue today. In particular, in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, and also in Ivory Coast, or also known as Côte d'Ivoire, conflict diamonds are still a factor that continues to fund human misery and suffering and conflict. I recently traveled to the Congo for about 3 weeks in January and February, and it was my second trip to the country in about the past 3 years. There was relative peace in some of the areas that I had traveled. However, there are still rebel groups active, particularly in the eastern part of the country, which borders Rwanda, Uganda, and Burundi. And these rebel groups, in part, are still there and are still actively fighting both against civilians and against government and UN troops, in large part because there's so much money to be made off of conflict diamonds and other natural resources. Because the government of the Congo, the government of the Democratic Republic of the Congo is still a very new state, and it is somewhat of a weakened state, they're not strong enough to assume control over their entire territory. The Congo itself is a very large country. It's roughly equivalent to the eastern half of the United States. It's a very large country. And it is difficult, again, for a fairly weak state to assume effective control over its entire territory. And so a lot of these rebels still hold control over eastern parts of the country. And as a result, we have what we're seeing is what the United Nations has called the world's worst humanitarian crisis in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, where you have, and I'm not kidding, 1,000 to 1,200 people dying a day, or 31,000 people dying per month. And most of these people are dying from malnutrition and preventable diseases. They're dying very slow deaths. And this is because they've been displaced off of their land. So when rebel groups come into an area, they want to seize control of an area that was once farmland and use it to start mining diamonds so that they can sell diamonds or other natural resources to sell in the international market. You're basically displacing people off of the land and then force people who farm the land. They can't just walk up to Trader Joe's or Starbucks and get food. They need to farm the land, and that's how they feed themselves. So when people have been displaced or made homeless, they are basically fall ill to malnutrition, and people can't farm. They're not able to access adequate health care, because they've been basically chased away from their land and all the available social capital and infrastructure into the jungle, basically. And because there's so little infrastructure within the Congo, because it's a very underdeveloped country, it makes it very difficult for aid agencies like WorldVision to actually access this population. And so basically you have the world's worst humanitarian crisis, largely because of the existence of conflict resources, basically rebel groups wanting to mine these resources, diamonds and other resources, to continue to fund their war. And it's not just diamonds in the Congo that are funding conflict, but also, in particular, a resource called coltan, which stands for columbine tantalite. And this is basically a core element used in the making of microchips and cell phones, which we find microchips, which are used in our cell phones and in our computers and other things. The Congo also has a lot of uranium, gold, timber, and many other resources that different groups and rogue actors would like to get their hands on. And that's this has been a significant incentive for rebel groups not to leave and not to participate in the peace process, because there is so much money to be made in exploiting these natural resources. So where are we now? Again, the video that I showed you is actually a bit old. It's from 2001, but in some ways we've made progress, but in some ways we haven't. So the more things change, the more things unfortunately stay the same. After much lobbying and a lot of pressure, thanks to Ambassador Hall and many others, the global rough diamond certification, known as the Kimberley Process certification system, was established in November of 2002. The Kimberley Process, again, is the current intergovernmental regulatory system that was established by governments to prevent the trade in conflict diamonds by actually regulating the trade in rough diamonds. Surprisingly, there are all sorts of regulations on textiles. So, you can look in the back of your shirt and you can see where your shirt, your jacket was made in this world, but that was not so. That was not the case with diamonds. Prior to the Kimberley Process, the only thing that actually regulated diamonds was their veracity. So if you had a real diamond, you had a buyer, regardless of the human costs. That was the only thing that regulated diamonds. So the Kimberley Process, established in late 2002, actually helped to begin to put some regulations on our industry that basically was unregulated, surprisingly. Again, the Kimberley Process it basically provides sourcing information for rough diamonds and prohibits the trade in rough diamonds that have been sanctioned by the United Nations Security Council. Currently, only diamonds from Liberia, which was basically the main smuggling or conduit point that smuggled out Sierra Leonean diamonds. So you saw pictures of the children dancing, their amputees. These were children actually from Sierra Leone. It was footage taken by our press officer when she was in Sierra Leone. And so Liberia is neighbor to Sierra Leone, and this is in West Africa. And so a lot of these rough diamonds were actually smuggled out of Liberia. They were mined in Sierra Leone by the rebel groups who were committing these kinds of atrocities towards children and civilians. Smuggled through Liberia, and then they made their way to London and Antwerp and the halls of the international community, all the way to land on yours and my finger. So currently, the only sanctions that exist on rough diamonds are actually still Liberian diamonds, which the UN has still sanctioned. But I just mentioned, as I just mentioned, Congo and Ivory Coast are actually two conduit points, which are basically where you have mostly conflict diamonds still funding human misery. And so that's an issue, the slowness and how long it takes to get something to move through the UN Security Council when you really need to sanction a certain country. So Sierra Leone, less of an issue of conflict diamonds because the country is now currently in transition. But now you have countries that are still in conflict and in the height of crisis, and yet we still have no sanctions on these diamonds that are continuing to fund human misery. And now moving down to where we are in the U.S. In the U.S., the Clean Diamond Trade Act was eventually enacted in April of 2003. Now this was legislation that basically ratified the Kimberley Process. So I will say that much progress, since we launched our campaign in 2001, much progress actually has been made in establishing basically a new trade regime and regulating diamonds. The percentages of conflict diamonds has actually dropped from what was once 15% of the global market. And so I think Mr. Hall said over $2 billion was made. That was probably the case 6 or 7 years ago, but currently those percentages have dropped. So what was the global percentages for conflict diamonds in the late 1990s was about 15%. Now, internationally accepted standards of figures, conflict diamonds has now dropped down to 1% of the global total market in the global diamond trade. But 1% of a multi-billion-dollar industry is still a lot of money. And still, the problem is still very huge because, as we can see, those are the consequences of conflict diamonds. So if you take 1% of $60 billion, the total global market for diamonds, both rough as well as polished, is well over 60 billion, and that's probably a conservative estimate, $60 billion. 1% of $60 billion is $600 million. However, you know, many of those in the diamond industry get very defensive when I use that statistic, because they say, well, rebels are generally trading in rough diamonds, they're not polishing diamonds, so you really have to use the rough figure. Okay. So the rough diamond market is $12 billion, so you can see the markup. Once you mine a diamond, the rough diamond is $12 billion, the total value of the global market for rough diamonds. Then when you polish it, you see that markup of $60 billion. The industry then becomes, when you make it polished diamonds and jewelry, it becomes $60 billion. So, rebels who are mining diamonds, 1% of $12 billion is still $120 million. And so, $120 million, which is 1% of the total global trade in rough diamonds, can go a long way in places in Africa where you can pretty much buy a weapon, an AK-47 for $10. You don't need a lot of money to wage a war in Africa. And so 1% of the total global diamond trade is still a lot of money. We've made progress, yes, we've dropped the statistic down from 15% to 1%. But 1% is still 1% too many. And that can still cause real harm. And so we need to continue to be alarmed and outraged at the very existence of conflict diamonds. Now there are several issues with the Kimberley process, and I don't want to go into all the details now. We can talk about them in question and answers. But one significant flaw in the Kimberley process system is the fact that there is a polished jewelry loophole. The current certification system really only covers diamonds basically from mine to factory. But there are no controls from factory to finger. So any rebel group could cut 2 facets on a diamond or stick a cheap stud on the back of a large diamond and call it a polished diamond or call it a piece of jewelry, and they're completely exempt from regulations. Similarly, Congress passed the Clean Diamond Trade Act in 2003, but the administration has really failed to fully implement the legislation by performing the necessary border checks for smuggled diamonds at the border. Likewise, the administration has not exercised proper oversight over the diamond industry. And so as a result, this was what has been well documented in a Government Accounting Office report, the GAO report. You can get onto the website, www.gao.gov. You look at their September report on conflict diamonds, September 2006. They've done an excellent job of documenting how the administration has basically failed to implement the Clean Diamond Trade Act. And by doing so, they are making the U.S. market very vulnerable to the importation of blood diamonds. The U.S. consumes 2/3 of the world's diamonds. 66% of diamonds end up here in the U.S. So lacks oversight over our regime, or lacks oversight in implementing the Clean Diamond Trade Act or complying with the international trade regime, the Kimberley Process certification scheme, really is a very significant problem that will have a profound impact on this global system, because diamonds are a global commodity. They're globally traded. So in particular because the U.S. consumes such large quantities, when we are failing to have proper oversight within our borders, it really has a profound impact on the efficacy of the entire system. So in the midst of this global issue where you have, vast sort of international policies and different institutions and different networks smuggling different kinds of resources from guns, drugs, diamonds, what can individuals do? What can a person like you or me or anyone do? It feels very big. It feels like it's actually impossible to change. But this is really about the consumer, because diamonds are such a high-profile consumer item that it's really the consumers that have helped to drive and help to change and influence international policy. The first kind of word of caution I would say before going into some of the very specific actions that we can do as concerned individuals. First, I'd say no to a boycott. I get asked that a lot. Why didn't you guys call for a boycott back in 2000 or 2001? Why aren't you still calling for a boycott now? Conflict diamonds still exist. There has been well-meaning sentiments by some consumers to say, I'll only buy a Canadian diamond. Just for your information, there was a large diamond mine discovered in Leone, which is in the Northwest Territories in Canada. And that has now currently placed Canada in the top 5 producers of diamonds in the world. So they are actually a large rough diamond producer. And they've started to put on their diamonds a little polar bear symbol so they can distinguish their diamonds from the rest of the diamond trade. Now, still the majority of diamonds are coming. The largest diamond producer is Botswana, which is in southern Africa. The second largest producer is actually Russia. And so, you know, the majority of the world's diamonds are still coming from Africa. And so, you know, Canada's trying to corner the market by saying they've got their own diamonds and they're not funding conflict. You know, and so when I hear people and they come to me and say, oh, I want to only buy Canadian diamonds, well-meaning sentiment, but I actually think it's a red herring. You know, because this, I think, actually has negative consequences for Africa's development. Better regulations and better reinvestments of diamond profits will actually go further in an effort to end conflict diamonds and actually to support long-term African development. So what I mean when I say regulation, when you have regulation and some levels of transparency in terms of how many diamonds are being purchased, you know, bought and sold or exported and imported in a country as the Kimberley Process requires, this regulation then forces a level of accountability for African governments to actually reinvest and do social development. So when civil society knows how much a country is making off of diamonds, they can then petition their government to make sure that they're building roads and schools and doing the improper amount of social reinvestment. But without all of that, there's still a global demand for markets. You still see the ads, Mervis diamond dealers and all kinds of different diamond dealers. There's still a very ready market for diamonds internationally. And so, you know, and that's not a problem per se, but when people are talking about boycotts, that basically, there's still a demand that basically just drives those resources back to the black market, and then there's less of an opportunity for these profits to actually be reinvested in social development in Africa. So that's sort of my preface to say no to a boycott. We don't want to boycott diamonds, we just want diamonds to actually be regulated and to support, we want diamonds for development, not for destruction. And so to get to that point where diamonds are actually being used to develop countries and actually help countries, I think there are really two critical things that consumers can do when purchasing a diamond, two things that individuals like you and I can do. First, remember the 5th C. So when you go into a jeweler, they'll usually talk about the 4 C's, cut, color, clarity, and carat. And they always talk about the 4 C's when you're buying a diamond. Remember to ask for the 5th C. Ask about conflict. According to research done by Global Witness and Amnesty International, two close colleagues, organizations that I work closely with, 58% of jewelers, both in the US and the UK that they surveyed, did not even have a policy on conflict diamonds. So you're talking about more than half of retailers that they surveyed within the US and the UK, 58% don't even have a policy on conflict diamonds. But the more that consumers go in demanding that they want to make sure that their diamonds are clean, the more likely that these retailers will actually only make sure that they source their diamonds from clean sources. So again, if you're buying a diamond or thinking about purchasing one, remember to ask about the 5th C. Some jewelers have basically warranties. You need to ask for the chain of warranties, basically proving that they have sourced their diamonds from clean sources that link up and that have come through the Kimberley Process certification system. Again, some jewelers have them, some don't. So if you know, as more and more consumers go in demanding that the retailers provide the chain of warranties to guarantee that their diamonds are clean, the more likely they will continue to source their diamonds from clean sources that have gone through the Kimberley Process. The second is to contact your member of Congress. As I mentioned, the administration has really failed to implement the Clean Diamond Trade Act. But as people contact their member of Congress, and putting pressure on our members of Congress will then in turn put pressure on the administration. Now, some of the ways that Congress can put pressure on the administration is through hearings, phone calls. A member of Congress makes a phone call to the administration. It has a lot of weight. It can carry a lot of weight. Similarly, passing legislation, and in certain cases, budget manipulation to accomplish their own policy goals. So when Congress gets whipped up about an issue, they can put all kinds of pressure on the administration, and then the administration will then likely do their job by actually fully implementing the Clean Diamond Trade Act. You know, if we as citizens put pressure on our members of Congress, then they in turn will put pressure on the administration. And this is what it's going to take to actually fully protect the U.S. market from the importation of blood diamonds. You can do that. We have an action on our website. If you go on to www.worldvision.org, again, www.worldvision.org, you can pull up the GAO report that I just mentioned. We have a lot of background material on conflict diamonds, as well as an interesting video, a commercial that we've gotten Martin Sheen to do for us to put pressure on the industry at the beginning of our campaign. And also you can send a notice, a letter to your member of Congress, basically covering some of the detail that I've talked about in our presentation. But again, it is up to us as individuals to put pressure on our members of Congress as well as on those retailers. So when you're going into a jewelry store, ask them about dependency, ask them about conflict, and also following through by contacting a member of Congress. Whereas I said, conflict diamonds really is about consumer perception and reality, and so because of that, consumers have the power to actually drive and change international policy. So with that, I'll end and I'll open up the floor for questions. Again, thank you for the opportunity to present to you, and I look forward to your questions. Any questions? Yes.
I actually have a question for you about Liberia, and recent reports that Liberia has been becoming more into compliance with the Kimberley Process and is starting to join it as one of the and the reports from the ground are any indications that Liberia will be joining the Kimberley Process and that it will be successful if Liberia is still using that time.
I have heard and talked to other colleagues of mine. They will likely probably join the Kimberley Process soon. And so I don't necessarily explicitly have any of my own personal concerns about that. I think things have changed with elections, with Charles Taylor now being out of the country. There is a sea change politically. And so I think that is just sort of the natural progress in ushering Liberia back into the international community. And so with the lifting of sanctions, that will probably happen very quickly. There will be no sanctions on any country with conflict diamonds, but yet conflict diamonds are still an issue. And so that's part of the conversation around the process, is it takes quite a while to actually move the international policy machinery, being the Security Council. And so it seems that it takes so many lives and so many amounts of death to actually move something. So yes, Liberia has been sanctioned for quite a while, I think since 2001. And so it's been a couple of years, they will be lifting them. I don't see a problem with that. But conflict diamonds are still an issue, so there are other countries that actually there needs to be more research and more advocacy to make sure that the issue in the Congo, and particularly also in the Ivory Coast, which I'm not as familiar with, that we address the issues of the use of conflict diamonds there, funding those conflicts. Yes?
De Beers is one of the main producers or owners of the diamond mines. Do you think it's up to the individual companies such as De Beers to help fix this problem?
Yes.
Or is it up to other?
Yes, I mean, it's going back in history, we have a Kimberley Process really because we were able to put pressure on the diamond industry, in particular De Beers and other diamond mining companies, but De Beers being the largest. And De Beers then put pressure on governments. They were the ones who were able to mobilize the governments to establish the Kimberley Process. And so the industry plays a tremendous role in this entire, in the efficacy of the Kimberley Process. I mean, governments certainly do as well. I mean, but it's an important partnership. De Beers is an interesting, they're an interesting case because they've actually changed their business model. They used to have a business model for many years where they actually would buy out the excess of all diamonds. And so they actually would, in order to control or keep the cost of diamonds at a higher price. And so they were known as a cartel, and most people are aware of that. They have since changed their business model so that they only purchase diamonds that have come from their mines, so that they have direct control over. And so I think they have mines in about 7 countries, primarily working, I believe, in Botswana and Russia. And so where they used to control about 60% of the market, they've now shifted their business model so that they're only controlling about 30 to 40%. Now, yes, De Beers still has a $5 billion stockpile of diamonds in London. And so that is still something that's sort of there and has been grandfathered in, but they've actually changed their business model. And so De Beers, they are now seeking to only source and provide high-end diamonds at retailers like Cartier and Tiffany's and Louis Vuitton. And so they are, you're not necessarily going to automatically always find a De Beers diamond at Kay Jewelers. So the reality is when you go to a store that's actually gotten their diamonds from a De Beers mine, they can provide you the chain of warranties. And so De Beers has led the way. I'm sort of choking and saying this because I certainly have had my good share of fights with De Beers. But they have, because they've changed their business model, because they're buying and purchasing diamonds only from their mines and certain kinds of mining called kimberlite mining, which is basically easier to control. Basically, you have two kinds of mining. You've got alluvial mining, which is kind of like the riverbed mining, like sort of panning for the San Francisco 49ers in 1849, the people were standing in the riverbeds and panning for gold. That's kind of also a little alluvial, that's called alluvial diamond mining. And so it's basically hard to stick a chain link fence around a river. You know, and so that's where you have a lot of trafficking and conflict diamonds, when you're seeing a lot of diamonds occurring around riverbeds. And that's the case with what you're seeing, what you've seen in West Africa, in parts of Angola, and Congo, where a lot of the conflict diamonds were occurring because they were over a broad swath of area, and it was very hard to maintain effective control over that diamond mining area. Whereas kimberlite mining, where a lot of the requires, it's basically deep underground mining, and so where you need heavy capital machinery to mine these diamonds. So for example, in Botswana or in Namibia, where a lot of the diamonds are actually mined offshore, or the majority of the mines are offshore, and so you therefore need heavy capital machinery, and you can control that. And you can stick a chain link fence around a big mine area, and it's a very limited, concentrated area. And so De Beers is basically purchasing diamonds from those mines, and so they have then led, and they're able to provide basically warranties, basically from mine to factory, from factory to finger. And so because they're basically able to control where that diamond has come from, who they're buying from, because they're buying it from their mine. And so they in their own way have been able to put pressure and maintain their market, but it's also they need to be leaders throughout the entire industry, and putting pressure on the other industry miners, as well as those who are getting from artisanal miners, those who are still doing alluvial diamond mining, to make sure that countries and governments are ensuring that their internal controls when they regulate the Kimberley process is strong. So it's sort of a little somewhat complicated, but yet it's not complicated, because basically when diamonds leave the mining area, they then are packaged and then they're sent. Basically, about 80% of the world's diamonds are going to Antwerp, and then another 10% are going to Tel Aviv, Israel, another 10% going to Bombay. So the majority of them, once the rough diamonds then arrive at these 3 major trading centers, they're then polished, set into jewelry, and then they eventually end up in the retailers. Yeah, the retailers are they're basically like you and I, they're just getting their diamonds downstream from anyone they don't know. But the more that the retailers start to ask that their suppliers give them the warranties that they're clean, that's how the system then strengthens itself. And so De Beers, because they control their diamonds from basically from mine to finger almost, because they're only then supplying their diamonds to certain retailers like Tiffany's or Cartier, they can basically provide those warranties, but 60% of the industry still aren't able to do that. And so De Beers needs to lean in putting pressure on other members, other major mining operations, and as consumers, we need to be putting pressure on our retailers to make sure that they can provide those chain of warranties. So it's a bit of a long question, but it's a bit complicated because the industry itself is, if you trying to look at a map of the industry basically from mine to finger, it's like a bowl of spaghetti. There's no clear word. It's a very convoluted industry. So, yes.
How you doing, Mr. Anderson? My name is Quentin Canto. I'm a freshman at the Elliott School. Thank you for that informative lecture. I just have a 2-part question. My first question is, I'm just wondering who it is that these rebel groups are purchasing their arms from to fuel the civil unrest that they're kind of inflicting in their own countries. And my second question is, what initiatives is the international community taking to strengthen these countries' rule of law and civil institutions so that they can have the further ability to regulate and police these rebel, so that they can have a better ability to regulate and police these rebel groups that are fueling civil unrest?
Very good questions, which I can answer. Maybe I can't entirely answer all of them, but I'll at least make my own attempt. In terms of your first part of your question as to where these rebel groups purchasing their guns, to preface this, I'm not an expert on international arms trafficking and small arms, so I can't get into all the details, and I don't know extensively. I can give you a general answer, and then I can refer you to an organization. I was just speaking to another student here. In general, there has been basically, particularly East Africa, but really throughout Africa, basically a wash in what we call small arms. They're basically light weapons, AK-47s, smaller semi-automatic weapons, have basically reached large parts of West Africa. On the cheap, a lot of these weapons are coming from Ukraine and former Soviet republics because they're basically, the end of the Cold War, they're basically selling these weapons, trying to turn a profit quickly. So you've got a lot of international arms dealers and smugglers who are smuggling these weapons in. And because there's very limited regulations on small arms and the trafficking of weapons, and basically key international countries, including the U.S., have basically put bans on trying to regulate and create a treaty to regulate the trafficking of guns and weapons, particularly small arms and weapons. they're getting them from anywhere. And because there's a demand for weapons from countries, and because you can get them relatively cheap, it's easy. So both legitimate dealers to illegitimate dealers, there's a demand. And so these guys are able to make their contacts internationally, and somebody knows somebody in the UK or the US in particular, where about a large percentage of these weapons are actually making their way to Central and East Africa and all throughout Africa. And they're able to continue to do the wreck, the havoc that's going on. So again, because I'm not an expert, I would refer you, there's an international network to stop the use of small arms trafficking. I believe it's called IANSA. I can't exactly remember the acronym, but if you Google IAN, N as in Nancy, SA, IANSA.org, I believe is probably the domain name, but they basically are leading and creating basically an NGO campaign to basically come up with a treaty to regulate small arms. Because yes, we have all these treaties to regulate textiles, but no major treaty to really regulate the trafficking of small arms. So somewhat in an attempt to answer your first question, but you'd probably do better in researching that because I'm not an expert on that. Now, the second part, I'm forgetting the second part of your question.
What kind of steps is the international community taking to strengthen these?
Strengthen rule of law in civil society. To be very honest, in my own observation and having sort of been working on Africa policy for the past 7 years, I think it's very piecemeal. I mean, to be very honest, I mean, again, I'm going to speak about Africa because that's what I know. More of an expert on. But here it's sort of a lurching and a stopping and starting, and it's a lot of it is about politics and who we want to support. So let's just look at the case of Somalia. Known failed state. Basically virtually ignored. You're talking to the State Department, what is the policy? I mean, overtly they'll say, well, we want to increase trade, address humanitarian crises, and to foster long-term economic development. That's the sort of line when you go in and meet with the desk officers or even the assistant secretary. I mean, these people know me at the Africa Bureau of the State Department very well. But basically it's a policy of benign neglect, at least say for Africa. And so you have many failed states and many weak states, but I think Somalia is a very good example. And then when there's an issue of terrorism and Al-Qaeda, you can see how our policy, or you can research and read on how our policy in Somalia is going, where we will then fund various warlords and different groups to try and basically push the Al-Qaeda rebels. And I'm not going to comment one way or the other, but our policy has been more focused towards maybe what is our permanent interests versus no permanent friends. And so therefore you're not always going to have a consistent policy of trying to strengthen governments. And again, it's a complicated thing because there are certain things that the U.S. can do to support civil society. But again, strengthening states and doing nation building and state work is a long-term issue. It's a long-term, and a lot of it is dealing with the political climate within countries. And so it's a two-way street, really. I think that more needs to be done in terms of commitment, both at the political level, at the highest level in the White House, both within the State Department and within our, basically our international donor agency, U.S. government, USAID, to really focus on civil society building and nation building. I don't think there's been a level and the focus that needs to be to really have permanent impact. But part of that problem is that we tend to have attention deficit disorder in our foreign policy. I mean, you sort of run from one thing to the next, what's hot, and then you don't have the level of focus. So when I called the desk officer to talk about an issue on Uganda, northern Uganda, and Sudan, because I covered the whole continent, and then I said, well, the response was, she gave me my sort of response to the questions that I was asking her to find out what was going on at the Security Council on a certain issue on northern Uganda, and the response was, you know what, you can't talk to me about Uganda because all the air at the State Department is being sucked out by Somalia. That's all we can focus on now. So it tends to be that they can't walk and chew gum at the same time. So, I'm sort of talking a lot about this because I really, in my opinion, in my experience, I don't think there's a consistent state building approach. Yes, we have different programs, they're disparate, but I don't see a unified policy approach into really trying to put resources and political attention into building strong states. We sort of pick and choose which ones according to what's hot and what's in the paper and what are our key interests. But in terms of, in my opinion, in terms of a long-term policy goal of building strong states, I don't see it, at least not in Africa. So I wish I could have happier analysis, but I suspect that's kind of how things go in policy world. Like, as they say, no permanent friends, just permanent interests, depending on what our interests are today. I think someone had a question over here. Yes, sir.
Ray Copson, teaching course on the African state here. you're saying that the Bush administration isn't really enforcing the Clean Diamond Act, and I wonder why that is. I mean, it's been disappointing to see them developing cordial relations with dictators in oil-rich countries such as Equatorial Guinea or Gabon, but you can understand the forces at work. Well, what are the forces at work here?
Gosh, Professor, I could go so many times with the sort of fights that we had with the administration. I mean, to the point where they didn't even want to meet with us when we were negotiating legislation. And we set up all of these details in the Clean Diamond Trade Act, from even forcing this interagency committee, because dealing with issues of trade actually is an interagency. You have to deal with Department of Commerce, you have to deal with Customs, you have to deal with Homeland Security, you have to deal with the State Department. So multi-agency, and so sometimes it's hard to get people to talk to each other. So we even set up this committee, this interagency coordinating committee, and they had to report to Congress. Bottom line though, I mean, part of the problem is it is an interagency process, and so when you have a lot of different agencies trying to coordinate, things just don't get done. It sits on somebody's desk. They hardly have a chance of talking to each other when they're within different bureaus within the whole department. So let me just go back to an example, maybe a more relevant example for some of the students you may understand this, but I used to live in Mitchell Hall when I was a student here. So Mitchell's way on the other end of campus, and I had classes in the academic center. Like, none of my friends who lived in Milton, it's not called Milton anymore, Jacqueline Bouvier Kennedy Onassis Hall, what is it called? JBKO, I'm dating myself. JBKO would never come to visit me at Milton, right? Because who would go all the way across campus, right? So you had to meet Marvin Center, or I'd always go on campus. So imagine, we're just students at GW. We live maybe all in 5 blocks. I mean, it's not really that big of a campus. Hard time trying to connect when we lived on campus. So imagine if that's an issue and you don't even want to go across campus. Imagine government agencies when they work at when they have different line managers, different agencies. So Department of the State Department, Homeland Security, Department of Commerce, Treasury Department, because Customs and Border Patrol is now under Treasury. They don't talk to each other. I mean, so I give you a very sort of crude example, but it's also very realistic, because distance, you work in different buildings, you have different bosses. People don't always talk to each other, so that's one reason. I think just the logistics of implementation. Second is money. Basically, and I remember when we were negotiating with these guys, they said, yet another unfunded mandate from Congress. We don't have the money. We are forced to focus on counterterrorism measures and money laundering. Now obviously this would fit, you would think that this would normally and naturally fit into the conflict diamond, into the whole anti-terrorism measures, because there's a very good book by Sebastian Junger, I can't think of it, but there's a very good book in terms of looking at the links between diamonds and West Africa and how they were funding different Al-Qaeda sources. This came out, the Sebastian Junger had written a book on this, as well as, and I'm thinking it was a Washington Post reporter, and it's a slipping, Doug Farah, I highly recommend, a very good book. It's by Doug Farah, I remember talking to him, about the links between diamonds and the connections to different terrorist networks, including Al-Qaeda. Now, you would think that this would naturally fit into, supporting and strengthening the Clean Diamond Trade Act, and the administration would want to do a better job of actually implementing it. But, again, they get very focused on one issue and looking for one thing, and diamonds doesn't happen to be on the list. And to a certain extent, I'm sympathetic with our Customs and Border Patrol agents, because they're overstretched, understaffed, and so if you've got few resources and few people at the border, they're going to focus on the one thing that their boss wants them to look for. And so whether it's cocaine or drugs, or whether it's, certain terrorist IDs or suspects when they're checking people at passports, that's what they're going to focus on. And so the issue is funding. Is there enough support to the administration to actually fully implement it? I mean, in order to get the piece of legislation through, we couldn't have an appropriations ask, because basically at the time in Congress in 2003, they said, no, you're not going to get anything passed if you've got money attached to it, because we need to cut back and we have a deficit. And that's the politics of getting legislation passed. But in reality, you need to have staff and resources to actually be able to fully implement and secure our borders from conflict diamonds. And so, you kind of take what you can get. And the reality is, to be very honest, that and I wasn't happy about this when we were negotiating, because it's sort of take what you can get. You get, something or nothing. The administration actually delegated the issuing of the Kimberley Process certificates to the industry. So what is normally, throughout the world, a governmental function, the industry, the diamond industry, the big problem You know, the industry themselves, which had created the problem with conflict diamonds, and were purchasing these diamonds from rogue actors. They themselves are actually issuing the certificates. The administration is delegated issuing government certificates to the industry, and they are supposed to have proper oversight over the industry and do random audits. But yes, hard to believe. So they're not doing that because they came back to us and they said, well, we don't have the money, we don't have the staff to set up a Kimberley Process Authority to actually do this kind of work. And so you either take this and we'll have some auditing oversight, or you get nothing. And so to a certain extent, even though it's a very unhappy reality, it's because there's not the resources, and because why don't we have the budget resources? Well, it's a larger geopolitical issue of where is all of our money going. And so if you want a piece of legislation to regulate it, you know, you take what you can get. But I've given you a very long answer, but I think it's because it's a complicated system over different agencies, there's not enough staffing and resourcing allocated to really support and secure our borders. And probably the third most important thing, people aren't screaming about it anymore. People aren't writing their members of Congress. To be honest, I mean, I'm not running the halls the way I used to. I mean, for 4 years, that's all I did was knock on doors talking about conflict diamonds. Now I'm writing about Darfur and Somalia. You know, and so as more people put pressure on Congress, they then put pressure on the administration, and I think that we can sort of change some of that. But until that happens, it'll probably be the status quo. Yes?
Rather than putting pressure on the African countries to take part in the Kimberley process, would an easier resolution possibly be to make all diamond sellers in the United States, or even better, internationally, provide a license or a chain of warranty to consumers that proves like legitimacy of the diamonds that they're selling, and how possible would it be to make legislation like this available?
Very good question, thank you. It's actually both, it's not an either or. The industry, I didn't go into all the detail in my presentation, but the industry is basically bifurcated, roughly bifurcated. You have the rough diamonds, that I just started to mention. You have rough diamonds which are then mined. So, for example, you could mine a diamond in Sierra Leone or the Congo, then they make their way to global trading centers, and then they're then polished and set into jewelry. And so the majority of rebels who are mining these diamonds, they're just mining their diamonds, and they're rough diamonds, and they're selling them to traders who are then going to set them. They're selling them to international traders who are then going to set them into polished stone jewelry. And then you have the whole other part of the industry that's polished as well as jewelry. And so then you have a whole other manufacturing process for that. And so really you want both and. So as I was mentioning, you have the Kimberley process, which is supposed to cover from basically the mines, from the point of mining to the actual, basically to the factory when they're actually cutting and selling and putting them in polish. We want really both. And the Kimberley process certification system at the time, the political traffic couldn't bear anything more but just regulating the rough trade. I think there needs to be legislation, and we tried to fight for regulation for polished stones and jewelry, but there was no stomach for it, and it was very difficult. So, and from this end, when consumers begin to demand that they only want diamonds that are basically sourced from the Kimberley process, because you can't have a polished diamond unless you have a rough diamond, right? I mean, it just doesn't happen to be polished. You don't just have a piece of jewelry that just comes up out of the ground. You don't have a diamond ring that comes up out of the ground. It has to be rough first, and it has to be manufactured and processed, and then it's set into jewelry or what have you. So you really need something to cover both hands, basically from factory to finger. And so the current system, again, as I mentioned, you have regulations, a set of regulations from basically mine to factory. We need regulations from factory to finger. It's a significant political process. I basically campaigned on this for 4 years, solid 100% of my time. And so it would take another 4 or 5 years if we're lucky to get something like that. And if there's just not this consumer demand for that, retailers will say it's just too costly. And they won't do it unless they're just getting the pressure from the government. So it's not an either or. You need both. Does that make sense? Does that answer your question? Good. Yes.
From what you're describing, it sounds like a consumer demand would in effect be like a boycott at this point, just because unless we're all tracking it.
Talking about the issue, then they move very quickly because it is such a high-profile consumer image. And so they can change when you have pressure combined with sort of celebrity glitterati making statements about diamonds. They will change very quickly. But until that time, they're very resistant because, again, they're business people. And so they care about the bottom line. And so unless it's in their service of business interests, they're not going to really take the effort to do that. But when there's a threat to that, it makes it very logical when there's a threat to that, then they will change very quickly. And that's sort of the flexibility, efficiency in some ways that business can have over government. So I don't know if it would per se say a boycott, but I think what it would do is it would force the industry to change. And what you would see that over time, as people are demanding more and only patronizing those shops that have basically policies on conflict diamonds and can provide a chain of warranties, you'll see that, you know, it's like a good business idea, oh, they'll catch on, and then it would quickly, you may see a sort of a shrinking and a restriction of the market, but eventually then, you'll see, I think the industry, because looking at the history, they did change very quickly and supported and endorsed and actually led in the establishing of the Kimberley Process. After a while, it was sort of strange. I'd walk in with a diamond industry representative when we were trying to push for legislation. It was very odd. Usually used to working with human rights groups and Amnesty International and campaigners were walking into Congress. Here I'm walking in with people from Cassidy's and Hill and Milton, sort of three-piece lobbyists who are representing the diamond industry, and we were lobbying together. So they can change quickly. I mean, I think as they see they start to lose business, they will shift quickly. I don't think it would be a boycott, but I think it would be, you know, it would put pressure. You would have probably constriction and maybe some diamond shops not getting as much business, but some would be patronizing those who do. So, does that answer your question? I think it's a possibility.
I just wonder how likely it is that you can walk into like a K Jewelers today and ask for a chain of warranty and get one.
It's hard. It's hard. But I mean, I think, you know, as we continue to put pressure on them, the movie Blood Diamond did get them very concerned. In 2006, I think, you know, people are starting to hear a little bit more about the issue, but it's very slow. But again, the FER campaign, it took quite a while, about 10 to 15 years to really get it in the public conscience. Similarly, you know, I know a lot of you have heard of Darfur in Sudan. Many of us have been campaigning on Darfur for 15 years. I mean, so it's not, I mean, you just learned about this issue, you know, maybe in the past few months. I've been working on this for 7, 8 years. So it's just that there's a lot of work behind the scenes, and it's a lot of slow, laborious work. And so when by the time it reaches the public consciousness, many people have been working on it probably for 10 or 15 years. And so it may take just as long, but it's still, the work still needs to be done, and it just may take a longer amount of time to change the industry. But I think, just judging from history, I think if there's enough public momentum, they can change. They can change. I can't guarantee they will, but they can. Okay. There's questions in the back. Yes, sir.
Yeah, can you comment on the size of the industrial diamond market and the possibility of conflict diamond getting into that?
To be very honest, I don't know a lot about the industrial diamond market. I mean, it is sort of a reality and a factor. Well, majority of those diamonds, at least when I was actively working the issue, were going to India. You know, but the issue is still the same. Diamonds, whether they're industrial diamonds or diamonds that are going to be used for jewelry, either one. I mean, a rebel can sell a diamond if he's got a buyer. I mean, that's determined whether it's an industrial diamond or a piece of jewelry, usually at the trading centers. And so the traders are then purchasing these diamonds, and then they determine, you know, the quality. They sort and they determine according to the quality of the diamond. But the first step before they sort it is actually that they purchase it, that they're buying it. And they're buying it from sources that don't have Kimberley Process certificates. That's why you still have that 1%. So whether they're industrial or jewelry, it's an issue, but not really. It's the fact that these diamond dealers that these rebels still have a market to buy their diamonds.
So those three trading centers, they serve both the industrial and retail.
Correct. Now the majority of industrial diamonds generally have been going to Bombay. You know, the majority, you know, but about 80% of basically the manufacturing for diamonds are actually happening in Antwerp. Small percentage in New York, in the U.S., very large, sort of specialized cutting, but the majority of the trading is actually, and polishing and manufacturing of diamonds are actually happening in Europe. So, yes.
I guess my question is for the retailers that can offer a chain of warranty. Are you seeing higher prices for those particular pieces of jewelry? Just like, you know, the sweatshop free T-shirts. You know, when you have a sweatshop free T-shirt that you'd like to buy for $30, but there's another T-shirt you can buy for $10, and you don't really know where it came from. Probably from some sweatshop. You know, a lot of consumers are going to purchase the $10 T-shirt. Are you finding that kind of a similar case in terms of these conflicts?
To be honest, I mean, I have not researched that, the comparison in terms of price comparison, because to be honest, I mean, diamonds are expensive, and to be honest, I'm not in the market for diamonds. So, you know, I have not checked. We were just doing our initial research to see who actually has a policy. So we're sort of more at the rudimentary level, but I think, so again, to answer your question directly, no, I do not know. But I think when I talk to most folks, they're willing to pay a little bit more, if it's $100 more, a few $100 more, to know that their diamond didn't cut that, the diamond on the ring on their finger didn't come at the expense of a ring, of a finger of a child in Sierra Leone. I think most people are willing to pay that, because usually when you're purchasing a diamond, most of the time it's for a significant event, engagement, or celebrating an anniversary, and so it's not something you purchase every day, and so to pay a few extra $100 to know that you have good conscience that came, I don't think that price necessarily factors into it.
Is that part of, I know that you were talking about that you're in favor of regulations. Would that be part of some of the things that you'd be pushing in terms of regulating price structure? I wouldn't know how you would do that, but is that something that?
To be honest, because I'm not a business person, I'm not going to, I'm not going to tell a diamond industry or K Jewelers or Tiffany's what they should be charging diamonds. I think they are the experts in knowing how to sell their product, but it's more making sure they have the regulations, and they can determine what the market will bear better than I am. I'm a nonprofit and humanitarian, so that's not my expertise, and that's not really an area that I feel like I should comment. There are other consumer groups who do, but that's not something that I'm particularly given to do that. But what I do want to push for is to make sure they have the regulations. So if they decide to pass the cost for doing that extra work onto the consumer, again, that may be the case, but the reality is the costs are very high. If you think it's okay for a kid to get their neck cut off so that you can wear a diamond tennis bracelet, okay, but I think most people with conscience wouldn't want that when they realize it. But like you said, the majority of the time people aren't even aware of it. So then groups like people like myself, have a responsibility to educate people and to let them know about the issue. And so again, I'm appreciative that you guys are coming out to learn a little bit more about the issue, and I hope you will take the time to visit our website, worldvision.org, and to research more about this issue, because I think, again, consumers can make the change if they decide to invest a little bit of time and effort in doing so. Thank you.
All right, so thank you for coming out today, and thanks for coming to all of our events this semester, and we hope to see you in the fall. Have a good afternoon.
Thank you, Rory.